Welcome to Everyday Economics, a weekly podcast about the economics in daily life. I'm your host, Puja Mehra. The COVID crisis will in all likelihood plunge the economy into recession this year. Will these difficulties last for a year only, or can India slip into prolonged stagnation? Well, depends. In the absence of proactive relief and stimulus from the government, the economy is certain to shrink this year and stagnate at low levels of growth for the next few years, to prevent which the government must shed its reluctance to play a more proactive Keynesian role. It must spend a lot more on providing relief and support to the economy through well-calibrated and sound policies. Given the situation on the ground right now, that is pretty much the only way India's economic future can be secured. Why Mr. Modi's government has been so reluctant to spend even months after the COVID outbreak is an open question, but it's important to understand the consequences of this reluctance that will begin to show as the year progresses. If the economy plunges into recession, loss of jobs and earnings will be unavoidable at all levels of incomes. Many poor who had emerged out of poverty in the high growth years before 2010 could slip back into poverty. There could be severe political backlash, acute deficiency of tax money. How will government then pay salaries, pensions and other bills for smoothly running the machinery that keeps it going? Given government's options are limited, it must really begin to find the resources for increasing its spending. The question is, where can it raise these resources from? Who can be made to pay for the relief and stimulus? This really is the biggest question of our times, and to discuss it, my guest on the show today is Professor Arjun Jayadev. Arjun is a macroeconomist and a professor of economics at the School of Arts and Sciences at the Azam Premji University in Bangalore, before which he was an associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Arjun is also closely involved with the Institute of New Economic Thinking. It's great to have you on the show, Arjun. Welcome to Everyday Economics.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're at the end of the academic year, and from this semester, you're going to be the director of the School of Arts and Sciences at the Azam Premji University. I gather this is a particularly hectic phase for you. Thank you so much for taking out the time.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Right. So what we're going to talk about today is, the economic challenge from COVID-19 and how this is unlike any other downturn. And what are the various implications of this challenge for policy making, etc. Because the lockdown was not used well, the virus could not be controlled. It's still out there, probably closer to us than it was in March. And the key economic challenge is no longer the trade-off between lives and livelihoods. The problems become much bigger now. The discourse is focused on the hardships of the poor and large number of people that have lost incomes. We don't know quite if this is irreversibly so, and I'll come to that part in a bit. But first, I also want to talk about the non-poor segment of the economy that powers consumption and investment growth, which is not getting talked about as much. The key challenge is that even if the lockdown was lifted completely, people, consumers, investors, producers may not immediately return to their normal way of doing business unless a vaccine or a reliable cure for the disease is found. And therefore, purchases of airline tickets, hotel bookings, tourism packages, purchase of cars, fancy footwear, everything has been deferred. And unless the threat of the virus is completely removed, this discretionary spending will not recover. This much is clear to all of us, but economists are trained to see what lies beyond what is obvious. In your expert opinion, what is the nature of the economic challenge right now?
So this is a good question, because in some sense, something like this we've only seen really 100 years ago, right? I mean, that's the only kind of comparable experience we have. And the really unusual thing about this COVID shock is it's both a supply side and a demand side shock, a very severe shock, a global shock at the same time. Economists have had historically really two ways of looking at major economic downturns like this. And for the first time in, again, 100 years, as I was saying, you have this kind of reinforcing effect of supply and demand shocks. Now, obviously, at the outset, you had production being shut off for weeks. So it was clearly supply was not there. We've permanently lost some firms, as you had suggested, and that's the nature of crises. But I think in particular, you're absolutely right to focus on the fact that the COVID crisis is an unusual crisis because it's a crisis that affects services worse than manufacturing in terms of production processes, and has special significance, therefore, for India, which is famously, as someone called it, a precocious economy, where a lot of our value added comes from services. And just as we are now seeing the effects of a climb out from the lockdown period, I guess we're calling it unlock one, right, at this current juncture, it seems clear, exactly as you had said, that the high-end services, relatively high-end services, are those which are going to be very badly affected. We have things like footfall in malls, airline tickets, and so on. And clearly, there's a lack of demand there. So now, going forward, it is overwhelmingly a demand-side story, right? And that is the kind of way that we have to conceive of it, I think, in this in this period going forward. I don't think we have had a situation in which uncertainty has been so central to economic thinking in a very long period. And I include the 2008 crisis, which was considered this really enormous crisis that hadn't been seen since the 30s. But even in 2008, it was clear that productive activity could always return. That in fact, one needed to do was to ring fence the problems in the financial sector. Here we don't have that kind of surety. So going forward, I think the biggest question is how we're going to sort of adapt to a new normal, whatever that actually means, and really try to understand how it is that one can bring about confidence in the basic act of going out of your house and feeling safe in your job. And right now, I think there's no clarity on exactly how that's going to happen. Every government is playing it by ear.
And probably this is what makes the challenge very different, as you're saying, from any ordinary recession or downturn. Jobs are being axed, and partly because the economy wasn't doing so well even before the outbreak, and now companies can just begin to correct their wage bills, but also because they're adjusting to the new challenge post COVID-19. These jobs may not return anytime soon. So apart from the discretionary spending, there's going to be a loss of incomes, and there's going to be a loss of purchasing power. And in these circumstances, the usual tools that governments might use to fight a recession are not going to be terribly helpful, are they? Say tax ops or a GST rate cut or something like that.
So this is a good question, and I think we don't have a full answer to this. Let's just sort of, in any case, go back to what actually the government has done, and as you said, a very important point, that in fact the economy was not doing very well prior to this, right? I think that's an important consideration right at the outset. So yes, so look, India had been undergoing the beginnings, or even in fact more than the beginnings of a demand-led slowdown, even prior to the COVID crisis. It's really hard to imagine, in January and February, everybody was asking what the finance minister would do to address these kind of questions, and now suddenly 3 months later we have much more severe questions. But it seems to me that right from the outset, this government and governments before that have been perhaps over-focused on concerns about the deficit or debt to GDP ratios and so on. Purely, I'm here talking not about operational issues, as in how much money can actually be spent well and so on, but just basically worrying too much about particular numbers, whether it's through the FRBM or the Encasing Committee report. Those were separate, as you know, separate committees. Both had a very, if you will, Austerian bent, right? And so my immediate submission here is that with private investment not being terribly impressive in the last 8 years, the debt overhang continuing to be there, the base of consumers who could actually continue to spend in discretionary spending, both being in some sense perhaps tapped out, but also facing this COVID crisis, that really you have no way of going about any sort of recovery in demand without some very serious government spending, right? Actual spending. That seems to be, in some sense, the classic question. Now, in India, we have many reasons, political economy reasons, to think about this carefully, whether or not this money is being used well, whether there are any negatives to this. Typically, the negatives are two that we can think of: inflation, which in this case may not be a big problem, and of course, external forces. What's going to happen with capital flight and so on, which may happen as a result of spending. So my immediate submission here is that the standard things that you're talking about, let's say a tax cut and so on, is not going to do the job, because in fact the tax cut will not spending, but actually moving some activity, government sponsored activity, however you want to call it, into actual spending is the only go we have at the moment, unfortunately or fortunately.
Let's sort of break this down, this whole complex thing down into four parts.
Okay.
There are four things that we need to figure out. First, what is it that the economic policy must do right now? What is the objective of policy? What is the task for policy right now? What should they try to achieve? Second, if they once they've decided what it is that policy must do, what are the levers they must use to accomplish their objectives? Third, of course, what are the resources available, and from what all sources can more resources be raised should there be need? And finally, I think it must be said. What is going to be the cost of making erroneous judgments in deciding the above three? Because we must know what is going to be the cost of not doing what you're saying, so that probably makes the policymaker's job easier.
Yeah.
Let's start with the first question. So, what is the task of economic policy right now?
Okay, good. So let's two elements, right? To the extent possible, let's talk about the supply side. To the extent possible, making people feel safe to enter the economy, to enter day-to-day life. This is actually a regulatory, public health, all kinds of government sectors are going to be involved in making sure that that element of trying to create as much safety as possible in actually undertaking work. That's a separate question. I think that there are different ways to go about this, but it's not a standard economics question. It's in some sense a public health question. The economic question, I think it's quite clear that in the absence of private sector demand, as we've spoken about, the first and most important thing is to find ways to get income into people's hands. I think this has been said many times in different fora. So whether it's actually direct transfers to people or it's direct government spending, which will then on particular projects that will be which quite easily can actually lead to expenditure on the ground, whether it's providing states with the ability to undertake expenditures and not be bound very strongly to our current legal chains in this particular context. There's many different things that need to be done, but specifically, I think the simplest way to think about it is getting consumption power into people's hands. Now, of course, they're not going to be spending on exactly the kind of goods that they were and services that they were going to be spending on before. But in the absence of doing that, you're actually compounding the problem. You're going to have this continuous paradox of thrift, is the old Keynesian saw was. But I think that that's the first and most important thing that you can do in terms of a policy framework. Now, there are many different levers, and if you wanted to go to the levers, I want to just, before I get there, sort of note how really, I think sadistic we have been as a government, as a society and as a government in the way that we've gone about it so far. Obviously, everyone was transfixed, during the lockdown to the question of the migrants and their hardships. And of course, not just the migrants, but anyone who was in the informal sector was facing very serious, hardship at that time. And there was almost no attempt to actually find ways to get funds into their hands. Then we saw this, Sturm und Drang, this really, this theater that we see, this 8 p.m. theater that we often see. We see the Prime Minister say there's this 10% of GDP stimulus that's coming in. And of course, within that does the headlines, and in 2 or 3 days, you actually see that it's nothing of the sort. So there's been, in some sense, a very strong, and I think very strange reluctance. I don't understand it fully. Reluctance to actually undertake basic expenditure, which would be essential for maintaining demand throughout the economy. And so you're going to see these effects play out over the next few months. If you recall, earlier there was all these extremely optimistic thoughts about how growth was actually going to return, and in fact it would be positive growth, but only 4%. It went down to 2%. Now people are thinking that we'll have a recession, and that's fairly obvious. Even it's not a post facto kind of judgment. We would have known that even beforehand from the kind of actions that the government has undertaken, which is to simply prevent or not undertake any of the demand-based stimuluses that you would require. Now, having said that, there are obviously other things that they have done which are necessary. For example, protecting the discoms, making sure payments can be made with respect to some very critical, sectors of the economy. The things that the RBI has done, which is be finally a credit backstop to particularly important sectors, which are both employment and gross value added generating. So in my estimation, I think we should start off with the basic point that we have been very reluctant to undertake these basic expenditures. Now, if we wanted to undertake them, that is a harder question, right? And for the reason it's a harder question, I think, is that the government has been, and I'm not saying just the central government, but we have been unable as a society in many periods to actually move a substantial amount of GDP into the economy with haste, right? So we've had these ideas, okay, infrastructural projects, or we've had ideas like, any other ideas, and clearly we've been able to, housing, for example, we've been able to do a little, but the speed and the quantum of actual stimulus has always been insufficient. So my thought is that at this point of time, one really needs to think about decentralizing some of those expenditures, finding ways in which states can actually undertake those expenditures. In this case, some decentralization, I think, is really, really essential. So that's the obvious lever is the fisc.
And you're right, this multi-part package has been a non-starter.
Yeah.
Fiscal spending is, on relief is far too less, and the Keynesian part to help recovery is lesser still. There is definitely a reliance on liquidity and credit measures.
Yes.
The dominance of liquidity support from the RBI and loan guarantees from the finance ministry for small companies and other borrowers clearly shows that the government believes that an increase in private debt rather than public debt is their preferred strategy for putting up a response to the challenge. Now, the way an increase in private debt versus an increase in public debt play out in the economy, those are two very different macroeconomic dynamics. And private debt will always serve private goals, even if it is backstopped by the government, as you say. It will not serve social goals or even public goals. And what we need right now for the informal labor or the migrant labor or poor people who are losing incomes and consumption and even savings, they're just saving. So what is needed is social security, and an increase in private debt cannot deliver social security, isn't it? So is this an effective strategy? Is this good thinking at all? What is the kind of relief and stimulus for fostering recovery that you would prescribe? A few details on what is the right thing to do.
I think that's a much better way of phrasing it. So let me kind of reiterate something that you're saying, right? Any strategy that relies on private debt accumulation is dangerous. I mean, it's going to always be the case in capitalist economies that you have private debt increases and decreases as part of the fact that it's a financialized system. Just as an aside, there is a very nice project called the Private Debt Project, which is run by a person called Richard Vague, which has studied these private debt run-ups in country after country. And as you can guess, it rarely ends well, right? it's usually the case that there is some sort of crisis, and in the end, the government ends up backstopping the private debt again, right?
It
I
happened.
think
It
it's
happened in India,
it
the
happened in
last
India
crisis.
clearly, and and in India, I hasten to add it happened at relatively low private debt to GDP levels, right? In other
Right.
countries, it's taken, it's gone to 100, 150 before you've actually seen the crisis unfold. Here, it happened much earlier. So that brings us to the question: but why is it that we believe that somehow the private sector is going to be able to pull us out of the situation we are in? This was the same question that was asked, if and going back to something that I'd said earlier, why is it that the growth model that we've had since say 2010 roughly has not seen private investment take off? Well, partly it was because of the credit overhang that we saw from the 2003 2008 period. So in some sense, liquidity and having access to extremely cheap finance and so on is the only way we seem to be able to have private investment actually be a generator of output in the economy. Now, this is an aside, but I think you're absolutely right to point out to the fact that we've gone down this road before. It's not been very successful. We may still want to, find ways to help firms deleverage and so on. So really trying to boost the economy through private debt accumulation may not be the best way to go about things right now. The additional thing I think which is extremely important, which you pointed to, was the idea that in some sense, what we're missing right now is really a safety net for the people, right? In many ways. And so if you are going to undertake debt and make and undertake expenditures based on this, there are some key places where it seems obvious. The two obvious ones are something like an urban employment guarantee. I find it very interesting that Narega, which has been derided for the last 15 whatever 2000 since its inception 12 13 years ago, remains the only sort of viable way in which people are able to actually generate something which is politically desirable and actually gives people employment and security. I think the time has come for thinking about something like that in as an urban employment guarantee. And that is going to be something that is going to require a phase shift in the way that we think of ourselves as an economy. I'm not advocating necessarily, an extremely leaden, hugely regulatory state at all. But I am thinking that if we're going to have a safety net, an urban employment safety net is just as important as we have a rural employment safety net. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's obvious, and I mean, it's awful to have to think about this at this particular juncture. But the reason why we are failing so badly in many of our responses to COVID is that we have simply underinvested for decades in public health, and that's both a question of people's welfare, but also a place where you actually have the potential to employ people. I mean, it's what the British economist Adair Turner calls a high touch sector. Touch. I mean, before COVID, that was a better phrase, but it really means that where you actually have people, really interacting with each other, where you actually can absorb labor, which is skilled or even semi-skilled, in a way that you can't, for example, in manufacturing, because you really need people for healthcare. So both healthcare and obviously, uh, as I said, an urban employment guarantee would be natural places where you could actually see such spending. Now, for the healthcare, it's obviously not something that you would see benefits from in terms of actual spending very quickly. But with the urban employment guarantee or even employment guarantee being expanded and monies in the employment guarantees being expanded, that we would see a relatively immediate impact.
Right, and with killing many birds with one stone, because you of course generate demand, but you can also probably take care of some of the public health deficits and maybe infrastructure deficit, etc. Which are other important things to look
Yes.
at. Yeah, now let's talk about resources, which you were talking about. And the main question, if this is all that has to be done, obviously, is that, what is the government's ability to spend? It's clearly constrained, and, it's really no secret that the government's fiscal policy is operating under severe limitations even before COVID. The tax revenue collections were weak, and the central government's fiscal position has only become weaker now with tax collections really suffering. If you believe the CAG, the fiscal deficit even before the COVID outbreak was as bad as it was during the 2013 taper tantrums phase. The government was in fact borrowing to even pay salaries and pensions. In such a situation, who should pay for the COVID relief and stimulus? Is it the taxpayers? But many people, when incomes are suffering, when profits are suffering, when sales are low, then how much taxes can you raise? Then what about a wealth tax? Is there that kind of wealth in India that you can tax it efficiently and generate the resources required? We've already discussed that, raising GST or other taxes, as by the way, we are seeing every day on petrol, diesel, etc. At a time when people, as it is, not spending, how much can you raise on those channels? So, what are the options? Probably, would you say the only way government can spend more is if it borrows more?
So a couple of things on this. The first thing to, the easiest thing is when there's things like excess cesses which are still sitting unspent, for example, the education cess and so on, that obviously can be spent, right? So there are some very obvious low-lying fruit. Now, that having been said, I think we've been sort of thinking about the fiscal deficit in some sense a little bit uh, as I've said before, a number that has to be hit for its own sake, right? I mean, so suppose someone 100 years ago said the price level was 100. Oh my God, it's gone up to 110. People would have like a very serious reaction to that at that point of time, because price levels were considered something that you had to keep stable. There was something natural about that. Similarly, I think we've naturalized the idea that there's the fiscal deficit has to be 3%, 2% or less, or that we should be running surpluses, right? What is a deficit for? I think that's the first thing that one should ask. And I think starting from basic economic and logical principles, you should have a fiscal deficit which is aiming fundamentally to making sure that if there's a private sector shortfall in employing your resources, you employ the resources yourself, right? As long as you're able to do that without creating negative effects on the I'll get to the resource question in a second. So just hold on. As long as you're able to get to that level where you're actually employing your resources, you're not short of resources. I think here's the key problem that people kind of misunderstand. As long as you have unemployed resources, you're not short of real resources. You're only short of the means of payment for that, right? And if that is the case, then there's obviously two things you can do. The first is to try to get monies which were not going to be spent, let's say a wealth tax or something like that, to undertake expenditure. And that's something you could do. But the other obvious thing to do, which people see as really sort of heretical nowadays, is to monetize the deficit, right? Or to find ways in which I don't like the word to print money, but basically you find ways in which you swap out government debt directly with money, with new money. Now, I don't see there as being any issue with that in terms of a logical response at this point of time. The alternative, of course, is that you let the economy creak out the way it will, and of course that has many severe implications, not just in terms of the life and death of people right now, but also the political fallout, all the kind of negative things that you see that happen with the sort of austerian outlook, with austerity most broadly. So what are the channels that are available to you? I guess the first channel, as I said, would be to spend any excesses that you have. for me, the second channel is to take a straight look at how much you can monetize meaningfully. If you take a look at across the world, how much of government debt is held by central banks in many developing economies, India is not out of the range by any stretch of imagination. So you could clearly imagine that some government debt could be held, additional government debt could be held by the central bank, now by the RBI.
For those listeners who don't know what monetization of debt means, could you please explain?
So there's many different ways to think about it, but in this case, I think the simplest way to think about it is if the government wants to spend, they exchange. The RBI gives them money in return for a bond, right? I mean, that's the simplest way to look at it, and it's basically sits permanently on the RBI's balance sheet. Of course, it can buy and sell it. This is the way that it was done, for example, roughly the way that it was done with respect to many of these financial crises that you've seen in the past, that the central bank takes up some government and, in fact, sometimes some private debt as well. In the 2008 crisis, there was a lot of mortgage debt that was held as well by, in that case, the Fed, right? So I can see that occurring. Now, the question obviously is going to be, if you can do it, now, why can't you do it at other points of time? And that's a fair question. But that's a political economy question. There may be periods in which you feel like, oh, look, it's a dangerous thing to monetize the deficit, because you might actually create too much money, too much spending power for the government. And then you actually do have crowding out, you actually do have inflation, you actually do have the problems that you associate with too much spending power. This is not one of those times. So I think that has to be very much, part of the questions that are being part of the solutions that are being asked to this are being provided to this particular question. Now, the third thing you could think of is something like a wealth tax. Obviously, that's money that's relatively idle. We've been having rather unequal growth. I feel sort of ambivalent about this, not because of anything else. It just gives you the impression that in some sense, you're returning to a kind of set of policies in which you're going to have class war on the other side. Now, obviously, I think I'm okay with some sort of financial transaction taxes, which are which are sort of Tobin taxes, which would also help. I'm also happy with taxes on the very, very wealthy, but it's not, I think, a major revenue generator, and B, I don't think that you necessarily want to do that if you want to maintain a certain sort of political economy. So, in my sense, that's in my estimation, that's maybe something you could think about, but not something that's urgent or necessary to get us out of this particular demand shortfall.
When you say that that's an issue for political economy, what do you mean?
Okay, so in both those cases, so in the first case, with respect to the monetization of the deficit, when I say it's a political economy question, I guess the question that could be asked to someone like me is, look, if you give governments the power to monetize the deficit, as in fact in India we had until 1997, then what they will do is, even in periods when you don't need to do it, because it's something that is, likely to keep the economy going, to give people jobs, and is a source of largesse. Governments will just do that and create inflation and really destroy the value of money, which is very serious, obviously, for an economy, right? That you will create high levels of inflation. And has that occurred? Yes, indeed, that has occurred in many economies across the world, right? So I think that that's not an unreasonable question to ask, right? Whether or not the politics of the situation should permit us to. The politics of the situation is something that we should take into account when undertaking a policy like this. So, in fact, the reason for 1997 and 2003 was precisely because people were worried about the government's ability to monetize their deficits at will and perhaps create inflationary scenarios, in which case the RBI or whatever would have to come and contract the economy on their part. So that there was a set of, I guess, political economy considerations most broadly, and in some sense, an agreement that we would not monetize our deficits. But we've come to a situation now, 23 years later, where this may be a moment in which that's absolutely necessary to get out of where we are at the moment. So that's what I meant. With respect to taxes, I meant that it's one of those questions where a lot of people in the last 20 to 30 years have been, um, you know, clear that a particular set of political arrangements were there that would not make taxation extremely heavy for the very wealthy. That was, I wouldn't say necessarily a political agreement, but that's where we seem to have ended up in terms of our broad expectations of tax policy. And changing that at this point of time would be disruptive to at least that notion. Whether or not you want to do it is, I'm agnostic about, but that's certainly something that would change that political agreement.
The debt part, this debt, should the government raise it, is it going to be sustainable? And I ask this because even after the global financial crisis, the government had in fact expanded its deficit, and there was a spurt in growth, but that recovery was not sustained. As a result of which, even before COVID, we had both low growth and high fiscal deficit, and which is what has, constrained the government's ability right now to once again use that very same lever. So, what happens if the promised GDP growth is not sustainable after, increasing debt now? And what if that growth does not materialize in a sustainable way? And what happens once the immediate crisis has passed? Could
Yes.
we go back to that situation where you have an increased fiscal deficit and not enough growth?
So clearly, it's entirely possible, and I think one has to sort of think of these in medium term as opposed to short run projections. So yes, you're talking about the period, say, between 2010 and 2014. The fragile five period that everyone decries at the moment, and clearly, there was very serious problems there with
Yes, and
respect to
I
both.
just want to add that the only reason it became better after 2014 is because oil prices came down,
That's
which
right.
not only reduced the subsidy cost, but also
Yes.
helped government raise a lot of money through taxes on petroleum products.
Yes, definitely. And there's another thing that one has to remember that when you have a period of disinflation, as opposed to a period of inflation, you will actually see debt to GDP ratios rise, right? So that
Yes.
is also a very important factor in understanding medium-term debt to GDP ratios. In fact, between 2003 and 2008, we saw, I believe, a fairly sharp fall in the debt to GDP ratio. And that's
Yes.
primarily because of inflation, right?
The denominator.
Yeah, yeah. So in some sense, and in fact, historically, that's the way that actually debt to GDP ratios across the world have fallen. Now, I'd like to kind of talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. So in this case, clearly it's a necessary condition to undertake expenditure if we don't want to go, spiral down further. Is it sufficient? Clearly not, right? We don't know. Clearly, you could spend money extremely badly. You could, siphon it in ways which is not particularly effective for growth. All of those are serious problems, and I don't mean to just brush them off. I think there's serious problems of design that we have to think through, which is why I do think, where possible decentralizing to places where there may be some greater oversight and some greater public involvement would be good. But it is possible that you actually undertake certain expenditure and GDP doesn't grow, and so the debt to GDP ratio will be higher. But again, in the absence of inflation in the real economy, nothing bad happens. It's just that the number that you see, the debt to GDP ratio, is higher. Now, there may be effects in terms of international effects, in terms of capital flight occurring, international financial institutions which may be bound by covenants to not spend money in India because of various fiscal indicators. They may pull out. But then why do we have the $500 billion reserves if not to handle these kind of situations, is what I would ask, right? So I would like to basically suggest in this case that there are necessary and sufficient conditions, and it's possible that that something like this would not work to sustain growth in the long term. I would nevertheless say you just have to do it regardless and hope for the best.
The danger of passive policy making, probably is that India could slip into prolonged stagnation. If you agree with that, and given how we've discussed a lot what should be done, but we've also seen how what is being done, and there's a certain attitude towards these decisions and policies in government, and that's the reality. So what is the danger of passive policy making, and if there is a real danger of India slipping into prolonged stagnation? And the
So,
second thing I want to put to you, which is related to this, is that you said that you're puzzled why government has not been more proactive. Would you say that the real constraint here is not the administrative mechanisms for spending money or even the resources, but probably ideology? And this has actually, in some ways, been put forth by the finance minister herself in one of her press conferences, where she talked about the empowerment versus the doles debate. I wonder if this is just headline management, or if it is actually the real reason behind the government's reluctance to spend, because Mr. Modi is very conscious of his self-image. In his prime ministerial campaign in 2014, he sold himself to the middle class voters as someone who does not splurge their hard-earned taxes down leaky spending systems. And he has been, as you said, scathing on NREGA.
yes.
He has taken credit for direct benefit transfers. He possibly thinks he cannot go down the fiscal stimulus path that was taken by the UPA government. But at the same time, this is also confused positions, because the Modi government's policy of PM Kisan is nothing but cash support. So if there can be cash support for farmers, there can also be cash support for other groups. How can how do you view all of these
Square the
different?
circle, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, when I say puzzled, I really was puzzled. Let me start with the first question. What's the danger of actually not getting ahead, if you will, of um, of the economic situation and falling behind and being reactive and being passive, as you suggested? Well, the dangers are extremely large, right? If India is not able to generate really productive, inclusive growth in the next 5 to 10 years, we have lost our advantage. I mean, this is the demographic bulge that everyone was speaking about, 10 years ago as being our, something that was really the reason for our moment in the sun. If we're not able to do that, we're not able to find productive employment and output for our younger people. You can't do it again. That really is it. So, and then you will find a situation where you're talking about two economies in one, a small enclave economy where people have jumped over, if you will, to the other side and are having, in some sense, both the incomes and the employment opportunities and the safety that you would expect of a middle income or an upper middle income country, and another group of people, large group of people who are outside looking in. I can only shudder at the kind of political, implications of something like that. This has also got regional implications. Clearly, the South is the area where you've seen the most sort of widespread inclusive growth, to whatever extent one has seen it, and that's not been there in the North. Especially in some of those states where actually the demographic bulge is much more pronounced. So it really is, in some sense, an existential question, I think, for India. These next 10 years are an existential question, which is why if you're not ahead of the game and you're really being passive and you're really thinking about things, our destiny is just going to come if we're empowered and so on, or self-reliant and so on. This is, I think, wishful thinking. So really, I mean, me, like anyone else, I think in this country, is just crying out for some sort of clear vision about how we're going to move forward. Without, in some sense, the everyone appreciates, I think, as Indians, we like spectacle, we like, targets and so on. And but those are headline management. On the day-to-day basis, I think everyone would like to see some more vision for the next 10 years. So I hope that answers my view of the first part. As far as the second part goes, again, this is something that I I am puzzled about. I don't know if one can call it purely ideology, because in some sense, the ideology of the previous governments, I would say, right from 2000 to 2014, and that includes both NDA and UPA governments, was possibly more conservative on certain economic elements, right? So when I say conservative, they did things in a more measured way, even if there was some sort of visions behind them in one way or the other. And specifically, the Vajpayee government was much more circumspect in some of these things. I don't think, frankly, there's an economic ideology. I think it's my read into this is that it's much more opportunistic and based on a politics of spectacle than anything else. I mean, look at the number of things that have happened. Demonetization, being the big one before this, the debacle that we've seen right now in this response, things like and just the management, for example, between the RBI and the government. So there seems to be nothing that really is an undergirding principle that one can rely on as a guidepost, to what actions are going to be undertaken. So that, I don't know if that's more worrying or less worrying. It is certainly more puzzling to me.
No, I agree. I also fail to detect any coherent ideology or thinking in the various parts of the jigsaw puzzle that forms the economic policy of this government. And I think nothing captures it better than the fact that, you have a Reserve Bank of India governor saying that we will do whatever it takes to fight the COVID-19 crisis. And you have a chief economic advisor sitting in Delhi saying that, but there are no free lunches and therefore we cannot just go out and spend as much as people expect us to. So I think that just captures the complete disconnect in thinking and betrays, the whole approach to policy making in this government.
Yes.
Before I close the show and thank you, I'd like you to please share some recommendations for books and articles for those listeners that may want to read further on some of the things that you've talked about.
Sure. I think one of the key issues that we've been talking about is the question of the demographic bulge, employment, and so on. Although this might be somewhat self-serving, I'd recommend the work that's done by Azim Premji University's Center for Sustainable Employment. There are two reports called The State of Working India, which gives you a really good overview of what is happening with respect to the employment situation in India. So that's the first kind of recommendation and report on recommendation of a report for what's going on with labor. With respect to the overall process of growth and development in India, there's many books obviously that one could read. You could take more right-wing books like books by Arvind Panagaria, or more left-wing books such as those by Drez and Sen. But I actually think a very interesting book that people might enjoy, which is a fiction or semi-fiction book, is Capital by Rana Dasgupta, which gives you a very different view of the process of capitalism in India. And I've really found that much more insightful than any sort of coherent story that we're trying to tell about this really strange process and times that we're going through.
Thanks, Arjun.
Thank you very much, Puja. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.